We'd like to welcome you to the 81st Scripture Roundtable of the Interpreter Foundation. This one is focused on Lesson 31 in the 2014 Gospel Doctrine Manual, which is in turn focused on the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible. My name is Daniel Peterson, and with me for this discussion are Cassandra Hedelius and Stephen Smoot. And I think you can tell which one is which. So we're just going to get into this, I think, by looking at a little bit of the historical background to the book of Proverbs. And Brother Smoot, I believe you've prepared something along those lines.
Yeah, sure. So just for brief background into the history and the authorship of the book of Proverbs. So it's difficult to date the composition of the book of Proverbs, as is other historical wisdom texts. By the way, Proverbs falls under a genre of text called wisdom literature or wisdom texts. You can probably guess why, because the whole point of the book of Proverbs is, and this may be a little facetious, but the idea is it was an ancient self-help book. It was a text that was meant to impart wisdom or advice to people to help them live better lives. And we have examples of this kind of literature in Egypt, we have it in Mesopotamia, but it's difficult to date these kinds of texts or the genre of literature, partly because of the lack of historical information within the text that can give us a concrete understanding of when it was written. Traditionally, the Proverbs have been attributed to Solomon. In fact, a number of the Proverbs are said to be of Solomon or by Solomon. There's no reason to believe that some of the Proverbs couldn't very well have been from Solomon or originated with Solomon. But we have to remember that it's not a single book written by a single author. The Proverbs seem to have been compiled over time from different sources, different authors that were then later redacted together into its final form centuries after the Proverbs originated. Most of the scholars that I've read seem to think that the Proverbs were coalesced before the exile, that is, before the Babylonian exile of Judah, which was in 589 BC. So it seems to be sometime before then that we have a number of Proverbs, some from Solomon, perhaps, but others from other oral traditions or the sort of wisdom genre, the sort of wisdom tradition floating around in Israel, that get redacted together and coalesce into a single volume sometime perhaps before the exile. That being the case, we can look at some comparable wisdom texts from, for example, Egypt to give us a good understanding of, or a good idea of when the Proverbs may have been written. And we actually have an example of this, and we have a good parallel between our book of Proverbs and an Egyptian form of wisdom literature. So, really quickly, I want to go through two Egyptian wisdom texts that are comparable to the book of Proverbs. And I want to do this for two reasons. Number one, to give you an idea of how scholars try to date the book of Proverbs, by comparing it to other wisdom texts that were floating around in the Near East at the time. And number two, because in my own humble opinion, I think there are some absolutely delightful things in these Egyptian wisdom texts that we Latter-day Saints can benefit from. So I'm first going to read from the Instructions of Ani, which is a Egyptian wisdom text dating perhaps to the New Kingdom. And I want you, I'm assuming this is mostly the Mormon audience listening. So for all you Mormons out there listening, I want you to listen to the words of advice that are being given in this text, because it has some very, I think, fun parallels with our own sort of Mormon culture. So here's the very first piece of advice given in this text. It says, beginning of the educational instruction made by the scribe Ani of the palace of Queen Nefertari. Take a wife while you're young, that she may make a son for you, that she should bear for you while you're youthful. It is proper to make people. Happy is the man whose people are many, he is saluted on account of his progeny. So right off the bat, the first word of advice is get married while you're young. And me being a BYU student, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Going over, you read this advice: do not raise your voice in the house of a god. He abhors shouting. And how many times as primary kids were we told when you're in the church, or later when you go to the temple, you're supposed to speak reverently and quietly with a small voice, right? Here's another one. Don't indulge in drinking beer, lest you utter evil speech, and don't know what you're saying. Okay, again, we have some ties there with the word of wisdom, right? Don't drink beer, don't become inebriated. How about this one? This is for all you husbands out there. Do not control your wife in her house when you know she is efficient. Don't say to her, "Where is it? Go get it," when she has put it in the right place. Let your eye observe in silence, then you recognize her skill. Okay, so some good marital advice there for husbands, I would say. Let your wife, do her deal. She knows what she's doing, right? So fun stuff like that we find. But more importantly, we go to the instructions of Amamemope, who is, this is another Egyptian wisdom text. And the reason why this one especially is important, I'm going to read a paragraph here from the introduction. So this is in the context of Scripture, a volume you can go get that has this. And here's the introduction. The composition of the work, the instructions of Amenemope, is now usually assigned to the Ramesside period, although all the manuscript copies that have reached us are of a later date. And so, in other words, the Ramesside period is roughly contemporary with the New Kingdom. This would have been, sometime around, I think, 1200 to 1000 BC, perhaps a little later off the top of my head. But here's what it says. It was during the Ramesside age that the tribes of Israel became a nation, and much of Israelite knowledge of things Egyptian, as reflected in the Bible, resulted from contacts during this period. The most tangible literary evidence of these contacts is found in the chips of the instructions of Amenemope that are embedded in the book of Proverbs. It can hardly be doubted that the author of Proverbs was acquainted with the Egyptian work and borrowed from it. For, in addition to the similarities in thought and expression, especially close and striking in Proverbs 22 and 23, the line in 22:20, in the line, this is from Proverbs, "Have I not written for you 30 sayings of admonition and knowledge?" That derives its meaning from the author's acquaintance with 30 chapters of Amenemope. Okay? So, and by the way, we've known this since the 1920s when the Egyptologist Adolf Ehrman published a very important article which he titled "An Egyptian Source for the Proverbs of Solomon." Okay? So there can be little doubt that the author of Proverbs was familiar with this text, which predates the composition of Proverbs, and directly drew from it in compiling and authoring the book of Proverbs. And this helps us date it because we can see a close affinity with Proverbs with this earlier text, and it seems that it's being drawn from the same historical time, roughly, okay? And to finally conclude with just two fun little instructions from Amenemope. Here's one, for example. Don't let yourself be sent on a mischievous errand, nor be friends with him who does it. Okay? And then finally, there's this. Don't start a quarrel with a hot-mouthed man, nor needle him with words. Okay? Pretty good advice, I would say, right? And then finally, this one's also really fun, and I'll conclude with this one. This is from chapter 25 of the instructions of Amenemope. Do not laugh at a blind man, nor tease a dwarf, nor cause hardship for the lame. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think it needs to be said that you shouldn't be making fun of people with physical handicaps, but apparently in ancient Israel, they had to really get that point across, and so that's one of the pieces of advice or wisdom that's given in this text. So, in the way of historical background for the book of Proverbs, we can see it's drawing from earlier Egyptian wisdom texts, and we can perhaps situate it in pre-exilic Israel. Some of the Proverbs perhaps go back to Solomon originally, but we should be careful in assuming that all of them do. And so there you go, I guess a brief historical introduction to Proverbs, keeping in mind this affinity it has with other Near Eastern wisdom texts.
Yeah. Well, thank you. As a matter of fact, in the last chapter, you have a few words, what is it, about 9 verses from someone called King Lemuel, who is otherwise not known. He may even be an Arab or something. That is a name that shows up in pre-Islamic Arabian desert poetry occasionally. And in a few proverbs from Arabia, who knows who he was, or whether it's the same person in both sets of literature or not. The impression I get of the proverbs is that they're a kind of pragmatic advice. They're not maybe the highest moral advice, like don't get drunk and make a fool of yourself, that sort of thing. This is not the kind of stuff you want to master if you want to become a saint. You're beyond that. This is kind of pragmatic daily advice about not making a complete doofus of yourself in daily life, being sort of successful in things you do. You mentioned the Egyptian proverb about not yelling or not shouting in the house of a god. I have to tell a story, and this is kind of I wonder if I should, but I'm going to anyway. I had the opportunity quite a number of years ago to lecture to the 70 on Islam. They had me come up and talk about them, about Islam to them. And before I was to speak, the senior president of the 70 who was there had all these general authorities together, and he said, "Now, brethren, when we went over to the temple last week, we were too noisy. And so, brethren, the temple workers complained. When we go over today, we have to be sure to use our temple voices." And I thought, this is like junior Sunday school. These are general authorities. But they were just, being Mormons and walking together. They tended to talk, and it got a little bit too loud. And here's the first quorum, the second quorum of the 70 being warned, when you go to the temple, be really, really quiet, okay? Speak reverently, and that sort of thing. So this kind of advice is always good, I suppose, no matter what you're standing, no matter what your age. Now, Cassandra, you had something you wanted to say about just general application and how we ought to respond to these wisdom sayings from antiquity.
Yes. So when I was looking over this lesson and just thinking about what I would do if I were a teacher right now, I'm not so lucky. I still need to bribe my new bishop. But if I were a Gospel Doctrine teacher right now, it's one of those lessons that kind of, I think it's intimidating because there's 2 whole books of the Old Testament to cover. Like, wow, that's a tall order. And also because it can seem so basic. You see these verses, these sayings that you've heard a million times, even if you haven't really sat down and read and studied it. And the lesson in the manual actually starts out with some of these proverbs that have just become very, very general in our culture, just things that people say without even thinking about where they came from. Just things like a soft answer turneth away wrath, and train up a child in the way he should go, things like that. And so I think that teachers can almost just roll their eyes and be like, oh my goodness, what do I do with this? This is so basic. And it is a trend that I have observed, at least, and maybe it's just me, but I think it might be fairly widespread, that in Sunday school and in other classes in church, we can be a little bit cynical and almost have these itching ears that we want things that are deep and new and deep doctrine and enough of this basic stuff. I want the meat, not the milk, which is usually a mistake, which is not going to be productive or helpful for the most part, because the scriptures are where we need to come back to every single time. And honestly, there is no deep doctrine. There's nothing beyond what is there in the scriptures, what is there taught by the prophets. There are better and more personal ways of understanding it, but if you're looking for just these brand new, startling insights that you have to have a PhD in theology to be able to grasp, you're not going to be a very effective teacher or learner, and you could end up in some very strange places. So while I was looking through the material in this lesson, just kind of a refresher course on how to teach the basics, I think, is useful, and this lesson is a good time to do it. So when your class is discussing things like wisdom, learning, and some of those despised primary answers come out, read your scriptures. Everybody rolls their eyes. Yes, of course. The primary answers, read your scriptures, whatever. Well, go with that a little bit. How should you read your scripture? What really works for you? How often do you read? What time of day? What strategies do you use? Do you highlight? Do you start with prayer? Do you end with a prayer? And can you share an experience about a time when you were seeking an answer, when the scriptures took on new meaning to you unexpectedly, or when it was expected because you were working for it and suddenly they just came alive and opened up to you? These are really, really fruitful discussions that you can have if you take the opportunity and don't dismiss these basic, primary things that we all know, we've all heard 1,000 times. Or trusting with the Lord in all your heart. Okay, we've heard it. We've all heard it a million times. But okay, so class, what does that mean to you? How have you come to trust in the Lord? What are the difficulties that you've overcome? What are the difficulties that you still face? How has your trust and your faith changed you as a person? How can you look back on your past self as someone who was more prideful, more independent, self-sufficient, so you thought, and then how have you changed into someone who is better able to rely on the Lord? What does that mean for your life from day to day? How do you make decisions differently now than you might have then? And so just in my life and in the opportunities that I've had to teach, even just visiting, teaching, or speaking with friends, these ways of looking at things and of generating new questions and new insights, and some of those really, really basic topics are really the best springboards for the best discussions. So don't let the cynicism creep in, and don't let yourself just dismiss this as a lesson that, all right, well, just kind of coast through this one. And see if you can really get a lot of meaning out of these things. They're old, they're familiar, but you can get some really incredible insights from them.
Thank you. I second that absolutely. I'm hoping that teachers and students in the classes will actually read the book of Proverbs through. They'll be surprised, I think, if they don't know the book well, how many common sayings they've heard as just proverbs in the surrounding culture are actually biblical. They come from this book, and they'll also find some nuggets that they're not familiar with, I think. And they'll also find some that are just plain funny. I think some of them are really funny. There's even a little bit of cynicism in some places, a kind of good kind, if you will. But for example, I'm thinking of this one in chapter 6 of Proverbs, where it says, it's talking about industry, industriousness. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. And then it asks, how long wilt thou sleep in the summer? And let's see, how long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? And then you hear the sluggard responding. I love this. Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. You can imagine this person rolling over on the bed, half awake, saying, "Now I'm going back to bed." So shall thy poverty come as one that traveleth, and thy want as an armed man. This is the comment to the sluggard who's just too lazy to get out of bed. There's several on that score. And then this one that has an unexpected ending. It sounds so charitable at first. If thine enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward thee. So treat your enemy well, so the Lord will really let him have it. Because you're being so nice to him, and he's being such a jerk, he's really going to get it. It's a kind of uncharitable reason for being charitable. But in other words, there are some fresh things here that are kind of fun. Paul actually cites that. One of his epistles, I meant to look it up and I didn't, but he says, treat your enemy well. Is it in Romans? I think it is. And he says, treat your enemy well, for God shall heap coals of living fire upon his head. It's not maybe the highest Christian ethic, but it's sort of realistic, I suppose. But there are some just wonderful, wonderful sayings here. And when you realize that they're, 3,000 years old, you realize that human nature hasn't changed that much. There are still people who find it really, really hard to get up in the morning and get to work. And there are still people who make foolish decisions, people who spend too much time partying, and people who are lazy, people who gossip. This little one, where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth. As coals are to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. I mean, have you ever met anybody that fits? Of course you have. Everybody has. And so you realize society 3,000 years ago in Israel, different culture, different language, before modern science, they still dealt with a lot of the same basic issues. And I think that's fascinating to understand. I wanted to say one more thing about the overall approach of the book of Proverbs. It seems to me that the principal audience of this book, it's a kind of, if it really does have any connection with Solomon or with the royal house, it makes it even more apt. It's kind of like the old mirrors for princes literature, where you get books of advice, sometimes rather cynical, sometimes less than the most exalted kind of Christian ethic, but practical stuff, like Polonius in Hamlet. This above all else to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not be then be false to any man, neither a borrower nor a lender be, all that sort of stuff. Now, Polonius is a gas bag, and I think he's meant to be sort of ridiculous. It's a kind of send-up of that sort of literature, but this is the kind of wise counsel that a parent gives to, in this case, I think the audience is preeminently a young man. There's all this advice about, finding a wife, and don't be betrayed by the strange woman, the woman who's out there lurking on the streets to lure you in because she'll destroy you. That's right. Again, Cassandra on my screen at least looks a little green, so we're definitely talking strange. But you have to. This is good advice for anybody, not just for a young man setting out. But it also sets up, I think, one of the chief themes in it. You start off with a discussion of Lady Wisdom, and it helps that wisdom in Hebrew, chokhmah, is a feminine noun. And also in Greek, for that matter. The name Sophia is wisdom. And so wisdom is personified here as a woman. And there's the good woman, wisdom, who's crying out in the streets, listen to me. But then there's the other woman who lurks around in the doorways on the street trying to lure you in to the paths of sin. And this is good advice to a young man, beware of who you hang out with, on a literal level and on a metaphorical level. Choose wisdom, don't choose foolishness. Choose a good way of life rather than worldliness and dissipation. And so I think the book begins with Lady Wisdom and this idea of the righteous woman, a good woman that you want to be with. And then at the end it ends with that praise of the virtuous woman, which again can probably be taken both literally, that this is the kind of woman you want to marry if you're a young man. Get a woman who will make you proud and who will run the household well and who will be respectable. But she's also, I think, Lady Wisdom. You want to choose Lady Wisdom rather than the strange woman. But it's a pretty powerful metaphor, especially if you're really aiming this at a young man about the age he's thinking about these things. Keep him on the straight and narrow, because every father who sends his son off to college, at least if it's not BYU, has to worry. You have to worry at BYU too. I wish it were not so, but there are strange women and strange guys at BYU too. But especially at some other places, you send your son or daughter off to a modern day college campus, and you hope they will survive, because there are all sorts of things out there beckoning to them. Come here, come to this party. Here's a kegger. Here's some drugs. It won't hurt you a little bit. Take just a drink, and off you go. And your life takes a decisive course. You weren't necessarily intending it to be a decisive change in your life, but it becomes one. So it is good advice to a young person setting out on a practical and on a metaphorical level. Now, Cassandra,
Yeah,
I think.
really
Oh
quick.
yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject. You were, reminding me of my own experience. I went to a party school, two of them actually, and so you are sending your kid off to there, call it the local institute right away. Just do it and make sure that your departing child, young adult, knows where the institute is and what the classes are and the activities, call the singles board bishop. Just there is one that's assigned to any school, even the party school.
Yeah. Oh, I have to say, one of my experiences, not much of an experience, but something that just struck me, was at a certain school that you did go to, just over the mountains from here. And I remember walking along one Saturday morning. I was over there for a conference, and I walked by a frat house, And what impressed me was that under each of the windows, there was a kind of like, you see them in the desert, an alluvial fan where the stuff is washed out of the mountains after centuries of rain, and it's formed a kind of, fanning out area from the mountain where all the erosion has settled into the valley. And under each window, there was a kind of pyramid-shaped pile of beer cans, starting at the window and then spreading out for 20 feet around each window. Then I was impressed. I thought, how much beer can they consume? But I thought, okay, they're free to do what they want. But a young person coming to a school like that, there are temptations. In fact, I'll tell a quick story. Years ago, I entertained a fellow by the name of, what was his name? They used to run, Zogby, Jim Zogby. His brother John Zogby runs the Zogby poll. I don't know if they've been bought by other people. Yeah, these are these Zogbys who did the presidential polls. And Jim was on the Democratic National Committee. It was a real experience taking him around. I spent a few days with him. He was on 2 phones, by the way, all the time, talking with people. And it was maddening to try to carry on a conversation. But he'd get off and say, "Oh, that was Jimmy Carter." The phone's ringing again. And so it's kind of fun to watch. But he was incensed when I took him at the beginning of his visit to watch a video about BYU. They talked about the honor code and how the students covenant not to drink or smoke or anything like that. And he was furious. So that's a lie. That's an absolute lie. Every school is full of keggers and binge drinking, and people die from alcohol poisoning. It turned out to be a big issue with him. And he was furious that we were lying to him, and I said, no, seriously. I said, I'm sure there are students here who violate the rules, but by and large, they obey them. You don't see beer on campus. So the whole 3 days he was at BYU, he would buttonhole every student and ask, when was the last kegger you went to? What brand of beer do you drink? And they'll say, I don't drink. I've never been to a kegger. And it wasn't until about 4 or 5 days afterwards. Yeah. A lot of them just had no clue what he was talking about. He finally wrote me an email and apologized about 5 days after he'd left Provo and gone back to the East Coast. He said, I've talked around. I didn't believe it there. I didn't believe you. I've talked with people around here who know BYU, and apparently you were telling the truth. Well, because they just can't believe it. But the point is that that's one of those things out there, and the binge drinking is a big problem on a lot of campuses now, and drug use and all sorts of things. So, so this is the kind of advice a worried parent gives to a young person, male or female, who's heading out, knowing that it's a field of minds out there. So, now, Cassandra, you wanted to say something else about, at least I think you did, about, let me see if I can find what you said.
Wisdom.
About getting wisdom, yes. And you wanted to talk about a prayer conference talk.
Yes, since wisdom is a female, after all. So here I go. So a lot of the Proverbs talk about getting wisdom, getting understanding, having the right sort of knowledge that comes both from learning and from the Spirit. It is really constant, over and over, which I guess makes sense in a book like Proverbs, which, if I understood your summary very well, Stephen, the whole point is here is the wisdom that we are imparting, both from whatever specific author, and it's just kind of this cultural shorthand for the stuff that you need to know to succeed in life. And so going off of that, how to get wisdom and how to talk to today's Latter-day Saints in your Sunday school class about wisdom and knowledge. So aside from my work as interpreter, I am also a volunteer with Fair Mormon, and we handle a lot of questions from people who have encountered criticism of the church, and sometimes they just, they don't know what to do with it. What on earth? I read this, I heard this, and they said that Joseph said this, or Brigham did this, or something happened, or it's just new information, new knowledge that they don't know how to put into place with their existing ideas about the church and knowledge, wisdom about the church and God and the doctrine, all of that. And so I was reading through an old I'm not that old, 2009 fair conference talk, and this year's conference is coming up, you should go. And another fair Mormon volunteer just talked about his story where something similar happened, and it struck me how central this process that he describes is to gaining wisdom. And so I'm going to sort of paraphrase this, but I'll include the link to put up on the post with this roundtable. And so his particular issue that he had dealt with was plural marriage, polygamy. So it says that he began to study the details, and he read a book by someone who was not a member of the church, a book about polygamy that just kind of threw a whole bunch of things out there, that Joseph did this and it was bad, and obviously he was a cat and a womanizer, etc. Some criticisms. And it said that he ran into that on pages 4 to 5 just immediately, and he didn't know what to make of it. But I stopped at that point because I had done the legwork to demonstrate, how to deal with these claims. The author dumped it on me and moved on, and I had to decide what to do with it. And so I knew 3 things. I knew that I didn't know enough to answer the questions, that this was great enough. I knew that finding the answers, if there were any, was going to take a lot of time and a lot of work, that he was going to have to do research, real work with real sources, not just what other people have already written or said about it, but going to the actual information. And he said, I knew that I might not be intellectually or spiritually up to the challenge of finding those answers or recognizing the answers or being satisfied with the answers. And he even had to come to grips with the possibility that the answers might not exist, that historians hadn't yet found the documents that explain these things, or the documents might not exist. Not everything in history has been written down. And what he did next is the key, that I determined to take that to the Lord, and it was one of the most interesting experiences of my life. The scriptures talk about having the Spirit give you words to pray when you don't know what you should say. Well, I thought I knew what I was going to say, but apparently that wasn't what I was supposed to say. I ended up saying something quite different. So much to my surprise, I found myself telling my Father in heaven what bothered me, and instead of begging him for answers or insisting upon them, as I had planned to do, I found myself telling him that I would not forsake him, that I would not forsake our relationship, that I was not going to turn my back on it or on him, and that I was not going to abandon my covenant. I told him that come what may, I would do whatever he wanted me to do. And then I asked him if it would be spiritually dangerous for me to do this research, to look into these topics. And so this approach, putting the relationship first, our covenants first, emphasizing our faith, and within ourselves being deeply committed to our faith, knowing what we know, first of all, that God lives, that we have made covenants with him, that is the basis for wisdom. Then, beyond that, he goes on to say that the answer to his prayer, Heavenly Father said, go ahead. You can research, you can find out all sorts of things that will be great and helpful and useful to you. There's nothing to be afraid of. Go and learn everything that you need to learn about this, but don't put your spiritual life on hold. Your covenants are a constant. You don't get to put them on a shelf while you halt between 2 opinions and decide if where your research is really going to support your faith or not. You hold to your covenants, and then Heavenly Father will bless you with the insight and the knowledge and the ability to find out what you need to find out. And when I volunteer with Fair Mormon, that's what I want to do. I want to provide the resources for people so that they can learn. We're not afraid of information or history or answers. We can provide so many things that will help people work through these criticisms that they'll run into. But what has to happen is that people need to remember what they already know, that they've made a covenant, that God lives, that they know the gospel is true, and that the church is not an evil institution that's been hiding things. Rather, it is the basis for everything that's good in their lives and in their spiritual lives. And then they can go on and they'll find answers, and God will help them find those answers. And so when you go about to get your wisdom, remember that all truth comes from God. God knows everything. He knows science. I remember once Elder Eyring talking about how he learned that the Holy Ghost knows thermodynamics. He was looking at an equation, and the Spirit said, "This is true." God knows history, and He knows everything that you're concerned about, and He'll help you find the answers. But first, the faith from you is required, the loyalty to the covenant relationship that you already have. That's how you get wisdom.
That's excellent advice, I think. Thank you. I wanted to say something else I forgot to say when I was talking about Lady Wisdom and the Strange Woman. I would be remiss if I didn't mention an article I wrote years ago called Nephi and His Asherah, in which I argued that there's a kind of goddess image going on in 1 Nephi 11 with the tree of life, or the tree from which Lehi and his posterity partake, and that Asherah may also live on in the person of Lady Wisdom. I mean, it seems that Lady Wisdom is a kind of reminiscence or lingering memory of that Asherah who was the consort of God. So I just wanted to mention that before I allowed it to be forgotten altogether. Now, Steve Smoot, we haven't heard from you for a little while, but you were going to give us a little bit of an introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes. And before I do that, I want to ask: does anyone want to say anything more about Proverbs? We're running at about the 40-minute mark.
If I can, Dan, I'd like to quote my favorite proverb, which actually goes with your favorite Proverbs. It's in Proverbs 19, verse 24, and I'm reading from Robert Alter's translation. By the way, if any of you, I would highly recommend that you get a modern translation or a modern edition of especially books like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes or Job, because it's poetry, it's ancient Hebrew poetry, and it's structured poetically in poetic parallelisms. Yeah. But our normal King James Bible you read from misses that, and it's set up in verses, so you can easily miss the fact that it's poetry. Whereas modern translations, such as I'm reading from Robert Alter's translation of the Wisdom books, which is an excellent translation, he shows actually the poetic parallelisms and the poetic lines. It makes it much easier to read and much more engaging to read, because you can draw out these insights, as Cassandra was talking about at the beginning. You sort of skip over these things, but I found it's helpful if you have a modern edition for that. Yeah. But in any event, this is Proverbs 19:24, Robert Alter's translation. The sluggard hides his hand in the dish; he won't even bring it up to his mouth. And you think, what's he saying there? And Robert Alter explains. In this proverb, one sees a satiric and hyperbolic relation between the first verset and the second. The reader initially wonders why the sluggard hides his hand, or literally buries it, in the dish, and then discovers that he's too lazy to lift it up to his mouth. The hyperbole in this way conveys a reiterated point that a lazy person fails to provide for his own basic needs. So I think that's pretty good, right? The next time you want to insult somebody, say, "You're so lazy you won't even eat your own food," right? Or something. So,
my father used to tell a literally corny joke about somebody who's walking along and he sees a funeral procession going along, and the guy that's resting on the bier is alive, and he says, "Well, what are you doing burying this guy?" And he says, "Well, he's the laziest man in the world, and we've decided just to bury him. He might as well be dead." And he says, "Oh, this is terrible. I can't permit this." So he runs over to the guy on the funeral bier in the procession, and he says, "Look, I've got some corn. I'll give it to you. You know, you can eat from this corn." And the fellow says, "Is the corn shucked?" And he says, "Well, no, you'd have to do that yourself." And he says, "Drive on, drive on."
Yeah. In Proverbs, that's the kind of guy you want to avoid and not want to be.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I've I've got to run for just a second. I will be right back. So, Steve, if you want to go and start doing your historical introduction, it turns out I'm alone here in the house, and I've locked my wife out. This is a very bad thing. I need to let her in.
Speaking of, Proverbs and how to treat your wife, don't lock her out of the house.
She's looking at me through our glass back door and giving me the what I call the evil eye.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I'll be right back.
Sure.
Go ahead, though.
Well, okay. So for our listeners, we're going to the book of Ecclesiastes, and the book of Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books in the Hebrew Bible. It's one of my favorite. It's also a wisdom book, just like Proverbs and the Song of Solomon and Job, and it's really quirky though, really idiosyncratic. It's not very often read these days, and it's kind of passed over because the content of Ecclesiastes is somewhat unsettling for us. So let's first go give some historical background. Ecclesiastes is, I guess, the English form of the Latin form of the Greek form of the Hebrew word kohelet, which is actually the second word of the opening sentence of the book in Hebrew. And kohelet in Hebrew, kohelet is somebody who collects or gathers stuff. The stem of that in Hebrew is kahal, which means to gather or to bring together, to assemble. And so what this seems to be is an assemblage or a gathering of, again, wisdom sayings or proverbs, you might say in a sense, being brought together and condensed in sort of a single thought or a single sort of flow. Famously, kohelet is translated as preacher in the King James Version. We can thank our friend Martin Luther for starting that tradition, but the term preacher is kind of problematic because kohelet is more than just a guy that preaches something. It's somebody that is actively trying to gather stuff together and make sense of it and form a coherent understanding of something, okay? And so some have been tempted to label this a philosophical text in that sense, okay? And there's some ring to that. Now, it says the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, is Ecclesiastes 1:1. And many have assumed that this must be Solomon, right, the son of David. And that, again, so it's been attributed to Solomon as saying these sorts of sayings in Ecclesiastes. Now, that's a possibility, but we have to recognize that there's no explicit mention in the text that this is belonging to Solomon. And in fact, it could very well be a descendant of David, a royal figure, or somebody who's trying to create more authority with the sayings in Ecclesiastes by attributing it back to David or Solomon. So keep that in mind as you read Ecclesiastes. And like Proverbs, keep in mind that this isn't probably coming from one single source or author. It's probably a later redactor who's pulling together these sayings into a single sort of form. Now, as for dating Ecclesiastes, as I mentioned with Proverbs, we can't. It's a hard time dating Ecclesiastes because there's no real historical information to go off of. However, there are some Persian loanwords in Ecclesiastes, and there is also some late Aramaic influence on Ecclesiastes. This leads biblical scholars to believe it was ultimately written and compiled sometime after the exile, perhaps in the Persian era, when Israel was coming back after the Babylonian exile, after Babylon had been destroyed by Cyrus of Persia and had granted the Israelites to come back to Canaan and resettle themselves there. It perhaps was written in this time or compiled in this time because of these reasons, these influences from Aramaic and Persian and so forth. It's also interesting, Ecclesiastes, so there's some historical background to it. And now, one of the reasons, I mentioned this down a later way, but one of the reasons why Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books in the Hebrew Bible is because it stands out in a way, it's unlike any other book in the Hebrew Bible. It's very, very pessimistic and cynical. At least that's how I read it. The preacher, Kohelet, he comes across as being very sort of misanthropic in a sense, okay? So it begins very famously in verse 2. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? And by the way, the word vanity there, both in the underlying Hebrew and in the original Latin where we get this word from, it doesn't mean like vain in the sense of you think of like Hollywood celebrities, right, who are dolling themselves up with makeup and jewels and stuff. It means vain in the sense of not meaningful or not worth anything. Okay, vain in the sense of like meaningless. Okay, that seems to be the underlying Hebrew root, at least. Something that's ethereal, something that you can't grasp onto. Literally, it's breath, hevel in Hebrew. And so something that's sort of out there, that's sort of this vapor that you can't pin down. This is what's vain, according to Kohelet. Okay, and he goes on and gives this whole litany in the preceding chapters. He talks about what good is it? You do anything under the sun, and nothing good comes of it. And wicked people rule everything, and you try to gain wisdom, but that doesn't help you out because you end up just dying anyways, right? Very sort of pessimistic and very cynical. And so it goes through and it gives this laundry list, right, of all these terrible things that happen in life and why life is so vain and why life, seems to be so terrible. But it ends in a very interesting way, okay? So if you go all the way to the end of Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes chapter, let's see, I'm in chapter 12. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, okay? So after 12 chapters of Kohelet going on and on about how life is vanity and there's no meaning to any of this and everything we do is going to decay and be destroyed and we end up dying in the end, this is how he ends up summarizing everything. This is chapter 12, verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And so even though there's this cynicism pervading Ecclesiastes, it ends on a really interesting, ironic, twist or note, because Kohelet ends up saying, you know what? Yeah, life sucks, and bad stuff happens, and it's kind of out of your control, but ultimately, if you fear God and keep his commandments, you can expect an ultimate judgment to reward your works and to reward the works of those who are evil. And so it sort of pushes our expectations in the future, in the next life, when we stand at the judgment, to be rewarded for our works, either pro or con. So there's a sliver of hope there at the very end, even though you have all this cynicism going on before. There's this little sliver of hope that it ends on, that we can appreciate. And I think one of the reasons why I love Ecclesiastes, why I love Kohelet, is because it's a very, very human book. I don't know anybody, certainly not myself, but I don't know anybody who at some point in their life hasn't thought, what's the point of all of this, right? I wake up and I go to work and it's this thankless job and, I'm having problems at home and problems at work and, whatever. I'm pretty sure everybody at some point has thought that, right? I have all these hard things going on in life. What's the point of it all? This is a very human response to issues in our problems in life. But then Ecclesiastes, like I said, ends on that very wonderful, positive sliver of hope note, saying, you know what? If you reverence God and you keep his commandments and you do good works, your reward will come at the judgment. And all those bad people that did all that bad stuff that you've been complaining about, they'll also get their just desserts as well. So hang out there. So that's one of the reasons why I love Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. It's a beautiful book. It has some great wisdom, like the Proverbs, but we need to pay attention to it closely and try to find these little things in there.
It's beautifully written, for one thing, and the King James Version is a work of literature in and of itself. The King James was, of course, done by some of the finest literary scholars and writers in Elizabethan Jacobean England. And,
if I could say something to that real quick, Dan,
yeah.
I don't know, well, to give as a living testament to the literary beauty of Kohelet. By the way, both in Hebrew and in the King James Version, even Richard Dawkins, okay, the famous anti-theist, hardcore atheist, even he had to say, yeah, I really dig Ecclesiastes, the King James translation, and everybody should be reading it. Even if you don't believe any of this nonsense, you need to at least read it for good literature, right?
Yeah.
So if Richard Dawkins can endorse Ecclesiastes, a book of the Bible, just on literary merits alone, I think we absolutely should, take that endorsement and go with it.
Well, I remember hearing about an African tribe years ago where they were trying to get them more books because there were only 2 books that they had in this very isolated tribe out in the middle of nowhere. They had the King James Bible and they had Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And I thought, maybe we shouldn't give them any more books, because if you had a culture that formed its English solely on those 2 books, Bunyan's being one of the great prose works in early English, my word, you could have some great writers coming out of that tribe who, if they were entirely formed by exposure to the King James Bible and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, you could do a lot worse, and most prose is a lot worse than that. So I thought, let's not send them any books. Let's just see what comes of this. Could be great things. Imagine a person growing up in in dark, jungle Africa, middle of nowhere with no contact with the outside world, but thinking in King James English. I would just love to see what that person would write. Yeah, it's a marvelous book. That conclusion that you quote about, the end of the matter is to fear God and keep the commandments. Some people have been so shocked by that after the cynicism of the foregoing chapters that they thought maybe it was an add-on, that somebody tagged that on, to save the book. They wanted to keep the book in the collection, but they were afraid that it was too cynical. So add on a little thing at the end, But of course, we have no manuscript, so far as I know, that would suggest it's an add-on. They all contain those verses, but it's marvelous stuff. And for anyone who's been around a little bit in English, you'll again recognize a lot of language, a lot of phrases that come from this book. I mean, there's a passage, for example, in chapter 3, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. I grew up in a generation when the Byrds did a song called Turn, 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 which is essentially that, set to music, and I can hardly read verses 1 through 9, or anyway, verses 1 through 8, without breaking into rhythm. It's like there are certain things out of Isaiah that I simply cannot read. I have to resist reading them in the cadence of Handel's Messiah, because this is just really good language. And again, I hope that people out there will read these things, not just a few selected pieces or verses, but take the time to read through these two books, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, to see some really fine English prose, at the least. If even Richard Dawkins likes it, then it's good stuff. Cassandra, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Whatever helps you think about Dawkins, he knows language.
Yeah, he does. He does.
He is a terrific writer.
Yeah, which is what makes him so effective and, you might say, from my perspective, so dangerous. But yeah. But there is a lot of cynicism here. But you could say, in a way, it is a way of looking at life if you have no eternal perspective. There have been writers, Camus in France said at one point, the really big philosophical problem is the problem of suicide. Why not just, life is meaningless, it's all pointless, it's just going on over and over and over again. Why not just do yourself in? I mean, what difference does it make a few years early or late? And from the standpoint of somebody who just doesn't believe there's any eternal purpose in it, the view of Ecclesiastes, short of those last few verses, actually is a pretty cogent view. It's a pretty clear-sighted view that here we are going to work every day, making a bit of money to keep food on the table so that we can get up the next day and go to work and earn a little money and put food on the table. And occasionally we have a good time, and we're sick much of the time, or things go bad. And why am I doing this? Why am I on the treadmill? This is not an exhortation from the Interpretive Foundation to commit suicide, because the Interpretive Foundation rests on the idea that that there is purpose, there is meaning, and that the view of most of Ecclesiastes isn't the entirely accurate view. There is purpose and satisfaction in this, but it's a pretty eloquent statement of a view that says, oh boy, it's just one thing after another. Now, who is it who defined history as one damn thing after another? I can't even remember. But that's the way it is. Human life. Someone said in politics, don't despair. There are no permanent defeats. Why? Because there are no permanent victories either. And it just goes on and on and on. You put down one international menace, and a few years later, there's another one. You fight a war to end all wars, and a few years later, there's another war. You bring prosperity to your country, but you'll be in a recession or depression fairly soon again. It always happens. And that's the way it is. So if that's all you thought it was, it would be depressing. So, any other comments about Ecclesiastes, or Proverbs, for that matter? Well,
going off of what you're saying, Dan, let me form my thoughts really quick. I think that eventually in this life, or very probably the next, we're going to learn that there's a lot more to life, just the fact of being here, being alive, than we're maybe able to grasp right now. Those of us who have the gospel, who have had the opportunity to make these covenants under or through the keys of the priesthood restored in this church, we have a very broad view and a very specific mission. But when I think about somebody who lives in maybe a country where the church isn't established, or I'm sure there are a lot of people who have never even heard the words of Jesus Christ in their life, and where life can be nasty, rude, and short. I think that we will learn that there is a lot more to their being here, their being alive, their opportunity to make choices from day to day, a lot more meaning and very profound importance in those things than we're capable of grasping right now. And so when the Ecclesiastes has this very cynical view that just keep your head down and power through and get through the veil of tears, that's not ideal, especially for someone who has the gospel and can at least be trying and striving to have a very joyful view of everything that we've been given. But in terms of life in general, there is a lot of meaning and dignity in that. Just get through it, do what you have to do to make it through this life, because even that is very meaningful. I don't know if that made as much sense as I wanted it to, but
no, it does make sense. And you know, in daily life, even apart from you know, the eternal meaning of things, there's meaning in day-to-day things, acts of kindness and family gatherings, and just 1,000 things that happen in routine daily life. There are problems, there are sorrows, there are setbacks and obstacles and so on, but there are also these moments of almost intense or genuinely intense joy and happiness that come as well. It's a constant stream of all sorts of things, but endowed with meaning beyond cosmic meaning. It becomes even deeper and richer, I think, and that's the perspective lacking in much of Ecclesiastes until you get to those last few verses. But it's a very sober view, and I think it's one of the things that makes the Bible so rich, is that it does give you so much to think about, including this, which is not your normal fodder for a Sunday sermon, but it's the way life can look. So,
yeah.
Well, we have
something for everyone.
Yeah, something for everyone. I mean, something for Richard Dawkins. So, well, we have gone very nearly an hour, which is about the limit we want to go, I think. Steve, are you still there? I don't even see you on the screen. Have we lost Steve? We may have.
I think we lost him.
He was there just a little while ago, just a few seconds ago, I thought, but he has vanished. So, well,
maybe he saw a wise lady and went to pursue her.
Yeah, timing is everything. So, well, all right. I don't think I have anything more to say. Cassandra, do you? Well, then maybe we'll close it off. I hope he's still around in the sense that he's recording this, since he's our technical guy. Or we might have lost the last few minutes. So, well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. With me at the end, Cassandra Hedelius from Maryland, right now, right? Are you in Maryland?
I am in Maryland.
Yeah. Okay.
Lovely thunderstorm.
Okay. And Daniel Peterson, and with us at least for almost the entire thing, was Stephen Smoot. So thank you very much.